In December 2010, a missing persons case led police to Gilgo Beach on Long Island. What they found was far more disturbing than anyone expected: human remains buried in the sand, the first of many to be uncovered in the months that followed. This was not an accident. It was the work of a predator, calculated and ruthless, operating in plain sight while law enforcement scrambled for answers. For over a decade, families waited, investigators clashed, and rumors spread, as the identity of the killer remained hidden. This is not just the story of the Long Island serial killer. It is the story of failures within the system, of victims overlooked, and of justice delayed. And once you step into this case, you'll see why it has become one of the most haunting investigations in modern American true crime. May 1, 2010. At 4:51 in the morning, a young woman named Shannon Gilbert dialed 911 from the quiet seaside community of Oak Beach, Long Island. For 23 minutes, her terrified voice echoed through the line. She told the dispatcher someone was after her. She begged for help. She said they were trying to kill her. Moments later, she disappeared into the darkness. And in the months that followed, the search for Shannon would uncover one of the most chilling mysteries in American true crime history. Shannon Gilbert was 24 years old. To her family, she was bright, ambitious, and full of life. She had dreams of becoming a singer, but financial struggles had drawn her into escort work arranged through Craigslist. Like so many women in that line of work, she was vulnerable, forced to trust strangers in isolated places. On that early May morning, Shannon traveled to Oak Beach to meet a client. Something went wrong. Very wrong. Neighbors would later recall seeing her running through the streets, banging on doors, screaming for help. But by the time police arrived, Shannon had vanished. For months, her family pleaded with authorities to keep searching. They felt something sinister had happened. Police, meanwhile, suggested she may have simply run off, perhaps drowned in the marshlands. But in December 2010, everything changed. While searching for Shannon, a police K-9 unit discovered human remains along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. And then another set of remains. And another. And another. 4 women. All in their 20s. All escorts who had advertised online. Each one had been missing for months. And each was found wrapped in burlap, discarded like trash in the dunes. They would come to be known as the Gilgo Four: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. For their families, it was devastating confirmation of their worst fears. For investigators, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The possibility that a serial killer was operating in plain sight. The case made headlines across the country. Reporters swarmed Long Island. Police gave cautious press conferences, while behind the scenes, tensions grew. If one killer was responsible for these murders, how many more victims were out there? And what really happened to Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose desperate 911 call had set this investigation in motion? The answers would only lead to more questions, and to the discovery of one of America's most haunting mysteries. This was just the beginning. In the next episode, the secrets buried in the sands of Gilgo Beach. December 2010. As news spread of 4 bodies found along Gilgo Beach, the quiet barrier island transformed overnight. Police cordoned off miles of coastline. Reporters camped outside the gated community of Oak Beach. And families of missing women held their breath, wondering if their daughters were among the dead. The 4 women soon gained a collective name, the Gilgo Four. Maureen Brainard Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello. All of them young. All of them sex workers who had advertised escort services online. And all of them found just a few hundred feet apart, wrapped in burlap, hidden in the brush. Maureen was the oldest, just 25. She had left her Connecticut home in 2007 to work in New York City, hoping to earn money to support her 2 children. Her last phone call came the night she vanished, and then, silence. Melissa, only 24, was last heard from in July 2009. After her disappearance, her younger sister received terrifying phone calls. A man, using Melissa's phone, taunted her family with graphic details of what he had done. He was never caught. Megan, a 22-year-old mother from Maine, disappeared in 2010 while staying at a hotel in Hauppauge, Long Island. She had a young daughter waiting for her back home. And Amber, 27, vanished just months later. Friends recalled how she had set up an appointment with a client who would be the last person to see her alive. Together, their cases painted a disturbing picture. Different towns, different years, but the same method of disposal. The same pattern. For investigators, the discovery raised chilling questions. Was someone hunting sex workers? Was this the work of a single, calculating predator? Or could there be more than one killer stalking the beaches of Long Island? As detectives expanded their search, families demanded answers. Why had it taken so long to connect these disappearances? Why had the police dismissed their pleas? For the loved ones left behind, these women were not statistics. They were mothers, daughters, sisters. And their lives mattered. But as the search continued into the winter of 2011, investigators would make even more disturbing discoveries along the coastline. Remains that did not belong to the Gilgo Four, and evidence that suggested the nightmare on Gilgo Beach was far from over. January 2011. The search along Ocean Parkway continued. What began as an investigation into one missing woman had already revealed 4 victims. But police were about to uncover something even more terrifying. The sandy dunes of Gilgo Beach were not hiding one killer's dumping ground. They were hiding a graveyard. As officers widened their search beyond the original discovery site, more human remains began to surface. First, the partial remains of another woman. Then, a child. and nearby, the skeletal remains of a man dressed in women's clothing. By spring, the number of victims connected to the case had risen to 10. 10 lives. 10 stories cut short. And each one raised more questions than answers. Unlike the Gilgo Four, many of these victims could not be immediately identified. Some were found dismembered. Others were missing for so long that only bones remained. One victim, known for years only as Jane Doe No. 3, would later be identified as Jessica Taylor, whose partial remains had been discovered in another part of Long Island years earlier. Another was known as Baby Doe, the toddler child of one of the unidentified women, discovered just a few hundred feet away. To this day, the child's exact identity remains unclear. The sheer scale of the discovery stunned investigators. Were all of these victims connected to the same killer? Or were the dunes of Gilgo Beach being used by more than one predator to dispose of their victims? Experts began to argue both sides. The similarities in disposal, the burlap wrappings, the location suggested a single, organized offender. But the differences, men and children among the victims, hinted at multiple killers. The public was left to wonder, was Long Island home to not one, but several murderers operating in the shadows? For families across the country, the discoveries rekindled old grief. Parents and siblings who had lost daughters years earlier began calling Suffolk County Police, asking if their loved ones' remains had finally been found. But the slow pace of identification and the lack of clear information only deepened the frustration. The case was spiraling out of control. 10 victims, no arrests, and a police department increasingly under fire for its handling of the investigation. As 2011 wore on, the focus of the case shifted once again back to the woman whose disappearance had sparked it all. Shannan Gilbert. When her body was finally discovered in the marshland near Oak Beach, it raised the most disturbing question of all: was she a victim of the Long Island serial killer, or the victim of something else entirely? Her frantic 911 call began it all. The search for her led to the discovery of multiple victims. But for more than a year, Shannan Gilbert herself remained missing. And when her body was finally found, it only deepened the mystery. In December 2011, search teams combing the marshland near Oak Beach stumbled upon Shannan's remains. Her body was discovered face down in the thick reeds, half a mile from where she was last seen. Her jeans and shoes were nearby. Her purse and phone, scattered along the path as if dropped while fleeing. For her family, it was heartbreaking closure. But for investigators, it created new controversy. Police insisted Shannan's death was an accident. They claimed she had run into the marsh in a panic, become disoriented, and drowned. Suffolk County's medical examiner supported the conclusion: there were no clear signs of trauma. But her family, and many outside experts, disagreed. They argued Shannan's final moments were too suspicious to be written off as an accident. Neighbors recalled how she had run through the streets that night, pounding on doors, screaming for help. She called 911 for 23 minutes, insisting someone was trying to kill her. Why would she run into a marsh barefoot, terrified, and alone if no one was chasing her? Her family hired a lawyer, John Ray, who pressed for a second autopsy. Independent experts claimed her hyoid bone, a bone in the neck, showed signs consistent with strangulation. The findings reignited the debate. Was Shannan Gilbert a victim of the Long Island serial killer, or the victim of something entirely different? The Oak Beach community itself became a source of suspicion. Shannan had been with a client that night. Some residents gave conflicting statements. And one man in particular, a local doctor who lived just blocks from where she was last seen, would emerge as one of the most controversial figures in the case. The mystery of Shannan Gilbert remains one of the most debated aspects of the Gilgo Beach case. Was she the first known victim of a serial killer? Or was her death a tragic accident that simply led to the discovery of another predator's dumping ground? Even today, the truth about Shannan's final moments remains uncertain. But her story ensured that the Gilgo case would never be forgotten. As the number of victims grew, so did the list of suspects. The Gilgo Beach murders were more than a mystery, they were a magnet for speculation. And soon, attention turned not just to strangers, but to people who lived right next door. One of the first names to emerge was Dr. Peter Hackett, a retired physician who lived in Oak Beach. In the days after Shannan Gilbert vanished, her family received a strange phone call. The caller introduced himself as Dr. Hackett. He told Shannan's mother that he had taken Shannan in, cared for her, and tried to help her that night. But later, he denied making the call at all. Phone records proved otherwise. Hackett had indeed called. But his story shifted again and again. Some neighbors recalled he often inserted himself into dramatic situations. Others found his behavior disturbing. Yet despite the suspicion, police never charged him with any crime. To this day, his role in Shannan's final hours remains unresolved. Another figure loomed large in the investigation, James Burke, the Suffolk County Police Chief at the time. Burke was a powerful man with a reputation for intimidation. He blocked the FBI from joining the investigation. He resisted outside help. And in 2016, he himself was sent to prison not for murder, but for beating a suspect who had stolen a duffel bag from his car. That bag reportedly contained pornography and sex toys. Burke's downfall only fueled conspiracy theories. Did he interfere in the Gilgo case to protect himself, or someone else? Other suspects came and went. Local residents. Former clients of the victims. Even disgraced politicians and businessmen were whispered about in online forums. Each new lead seemed to promise a breakthrough, but ended in a dead end. And as the years dragged on, the case became colder. The killer, or killers, remained in the shadows. And the families of the victims were left without justice. By the mid-2010s, public trust in the investigation was collapsing. People began to believe the truth wasn't just being overlooked, it was being buried. And that belief only grew stronger as the Suffolk County Police Department itself fell under investigation. The Long Island serial killer case was never just about a predator on the loose. It was also about power, politics, and corruption. Because his families begged for answers, the very department responsible for solving the murders was falling apart from within. At the center of it all was Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke. From the beginning, Burke had resisted outside help. He blocked the FBI from joining the investigation, an unusual move for a case involving multiple homicides across state lines. Why? Burke claimed local police could handle it. But many suspected another reason. He didn't want federal eyes looking too closely into Suffolk County. In 2012, Burke's name was linked to scandal when a heroin addict broke into his police-issued SUV and stole a duffel bag. Inside the bag were pornography, Viagra, and sex toys. When the thief was caught, Burke didn't just arrest him. He assaulted him inside a police station and then led a cover-up, ordering other officers to lie. By 2016, Burke was convicted of obstruction of justice and sentenced to prison. To many, it confirmed what families of the Gilgo victims had suspected all along. The man leading the investigation was more concerned with protecting himself than catching a killer. The corruption didn't end with Burke. Critics accused the Suffolk County Police Department of ignoring evidence, losing files, and failing to communicate with the families. At times, it seemed as if the investigation was designed to go nowhere. Meanwhile, the case was attracting national attention. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reporters all began to dig into the failures of the police. Questions multiplied. Why were the FBI kept away for so long? Why did it take years to release certain 911 recordings, including Shannon Gilbert's? And most importantly, had these failures allowed the killer to keep hunting? By the late 2010s, the Gilgo Beach murders had become more than a cold case. They had become a symbol of corruption, incompetence, and the silencing of victims. But as law enforcement faltered, a new force was rising: online investigators, armchair detectives, and a growing community of people determined to solve the case themselves. As the official investigation stalled, a new kind of detective entered the story, one without a badge, but with an internet connection. Online communities of amateur sleuths began pouring over the case. Forums, podcasts, and social media groups became digital crime labs. And in many ways, these web sleuths uncovered details the police had ignored. On websites like Web Sleuths, Reddit, and dedicated Facebook groups, thousands of strangers began connecting the dots. They created timelines of victims' last known sightings. They mapped out the distances between crime scenes. They analyzed the phone records, the 911 calls, and even the traffic patterns along Ocean Parkway. Some of their theories were wild. Others, disturbingly accurate. One persistent theory focused on the possibility of more than one killer. The Gilgo Force shared a clear pattern: young women, sex workers, wrapped in burlap. But the other victims, a man, a toddler, dismembered remains, seemed to break the mold. Could it be that the dunes of Long Island were being used by multiple predators at once? The idea became known as the dumping ground theory, and it divided even professional investigators. Web sleuths also dissected the suspicious behavior of Oak Beach residents. They questioned Dr. Hackett's phone call. They analyzed inconsistencies in witness accounts from the night Shannon Gilbert vanished. And they noticed something chilling. Shannon's 911 call lasted 23 minutes. In it, she said more than once, "They're trying to kill me." Why did it take years for that recording to be released to the public? And why did the police continue to insist her death was an accident? Meanwhile, journalists joined the chase. Investigative reporters dug into the victims' stories, giving them names, faces, and voices. Books and documentaries kept the case alive in the public eye. And the families of the victims, especially Shannon Gilbert's mother, Mari, became relentless advocates, refusing to let the world forget. Without this public pressure, the Gilgo Beach case might have faded into obscurity. But the constant scrutiny, from podcasts, online communities, and national media, ensured one thing: the killer would never truly be free. Even if he thought he had gotten away with murder. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach murders haunted Long Island. 10 victims, no arrests, endless theories. But in 2022, everything changed. A new task force was formed, combining Suffolk County Police, state investigators, and the FBI. For the first time in years, there was renewed hope that the case might finally be solved. The task force re-examined old evidence with fresh eyes. Advances in technology, cell phone data, DNA analysis, and surveillance records opened doors that had been closed back in 2010. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. A name. A man who had slipped through the cracks for years, hiding in plain sight. Rex Heuermann. A 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, living less than 20 miles from Gilgo Beach. A husband. A father. A man who commuted into New York City every day to work at his firm near Times Square. On the surface, he was ordinary. But beneath that mask, investigators believed, lay a predator. Detectives focused on the Gilgo Four, the original victims found in 2010. Cell phone records showed Heuermann's burner phones had been active near the times and locations of their disappearances. DNA recovered from a hair found on one of the burlap wrappings was linked to Heuermann's family. Further testing confirmed the match. And most chilling of all, prosecutors revealed that Heuermann had used Melissa Barthelomy's phone to call her teenage sister, mocking her, taunting her, describing Melissa's death in graphic detail. The voice on the other end, they said, belonged to Rex Heuermann. In July 2023, police moved in. After months of surveillance, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his Manhattan office. He was charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo Four, and named the prime suspect in the 4th. The arrest sent shockwaves through Long Island. For years, people had whispered about the killer in their midst. Now, he had a face, a name, and a history that would only deepen the horror. Neighbors described him as quiet but odd. He owned dozens of firearms. He searched obsessively for violent pornography. And he kept a storage unit filled with disturbing material. Yet all the while, he lived a double life, designing office buildings by day, hunting women by night. The Long Island serial killer was no longer a ghost story. He was real. And he had finally been caught. On the surface, Rex Heuermann was the picture of normalcy. A successful architect. A husband. A father. A man who commuted daily from his quiet Long Island suburb to New York City, blending in with the millions who rode the train each morning. But behind closed doors, a darker portrait began to emerge. Investigators discovered that Heuermann had lived a life of deception. His home in Massapequa Park was cluttered, run down, and foreboding, a stark contrast to the professional image he projected at work. Inside, detectives found hundreds of guns, disturbing online searches, and evidence tying him to the Gilgo murders. Heuermann had used burner phones to contact sex workers. He had searched for violent pornography that mirrored the crimes he was accused of committing. And he had stored meticulous records of his encounters, as though cataloging his secret life. Co-workers described him as odd, even unsettling. He often spoke in a monotone voice. Some said he was socially awkward, obsessed with details, and prone to unsettling jokes. But no one imagined he might be leading a second life, the life of a predator. Heuermann's family claimed they knew nothing. His wife and children were often away when the murders occurred, traveling, or visiting relatives. Prosecutors believe he took advantage of these opportunities to lure and kill his victims. The chilling detail, while his family slept peacefully in their suburban home, he was allegedly arranging murders from his office in Midtown Manhattan, just blocks away from bustling Times Square. For more than a decade, Heuermann balanced these two worlds, respected architect by day, suspected serial killer by night. How did he get away with it for so long? Investigators pointed to police corruption, overlooked evidence, and years of stalled progress. Others argued Heuermann's very ordinariness, his camouflage as a family man, allowed him to evade suspicion. But once the mask came off, the truth was undeniable. Rex Heuermann was no longer just a name in a file. He was the man believed to be responsible for some of the most notorious murders in modern American history. July 2023. After more than a decade of fear, frustration, and unanswered questions, Rex Heuermann sat in handcuffs, charged with the murders of 3 women and named the prime suspect in a 4th. For the families of the Gilgo Four, it was the moment they had waited for. But it was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a long, painful trial. Prosecutors laid out their evidence. DNA recovered from a strand of hair on the burlap. Cell phone records tying Heuermann to burner phones used to contact victims. Surveillance footage. Internet searches too disturbing to ignore. The defense, however, promised to fight. They painted Heuermann as a family man, a provider, a man being framed by circumstantial evidence. And so, the courtroom battle began, one that could stretch on for years. Yet even with Hoyerman in custody, the case is far from over. What about the other victims? The man found in women's clothing? The toddler known as Baby Doe? The dismembered remains scattered across Long Island? Were they also victims of Hoyerman? Or does the dumping ground theory hold true, that more than one killer used the dunes of Gilgo Beach as a graveyard? For Shannon Gilbert's family, the questions cut even deeper. Was her death connected to Hoyerman? Or did she fall victim to someone else entirely? Her 23-minute 911 call still haunts investigators, a final cry for help that may never be fully understood. Beyond the victims and the suspect, the Gilgo Beach murders left behind a legacy of mistrust. The failures of the Suffolk County Police, the corruption, the cover-ups, the resistance to FBI assistance, will forever shadow the case. For many, justice delayed felt like justice denied. But in the end, the voices of the victims refused to be silenced. Through the tireless work of their families, the persistence of journalists, and the determination of online sleuths, the truth finally clawed its way to the surface. The story of the Long Island serial killer is not just a story about death. It is a story about resilience. About a community that refused to let its daughters be forgotten. About the pursuit of truth in the face of silence. And it is a chilling reminder, evil does not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, it wears the mask of normalcy, hiding in plain sight. The dunes of Gilgo Beach may finally yield their secrets in court. But for the families left behind, the mystery will never truly end. The Long Island serial killer case shocked the world, but it did not emerge in isolation. To understand how a predator could hunt for years in silence, we must step back and place this case into the wider history of serial killers in America. Because this is not the first time society has been forced to confront the horror of someone who kills again and again and again. America's dark fascination with serial killers begins long before Gilgo Beach. In the late 19th century, H. Holmes built his infamous murder castle in Chicago during the World's Fair of 1893. Inside its walls, victims were trapped in soundproof rooms, gas chambers, and hidden passageways. Holmes became known as America's first documented serial killer. His crimes set the stage for a grim tradition. Killers who prey on society's vulnerable, exploiting blind spots in law enforcement, and often hiding behind masks of normalcy. The 20th century brought even more notorious names. In the 1970s, Ted Bundy lured college women with his charm, pretending to be injured, asking for help, then striking. He admitted to killing over 30 women, but the true number remains unknown. John Wayne Gacy murdered young boys in Chicago, hiding their bodies beneath his home while working as a respected contractor and even performing as a clown at children's parties. And the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, targeted sex workers in Washington state throughout the 1980s and 90s. He was later convicted of 49 murders, making him one of the most prolific killers in American history. These crimes reveal chilling patterns. The victims are often women, frequently sex workers or those living on the margins of society. People less likely to be reported missing quickly, less likely to spark a nationwide manhunt. The killers themselves? They appear ordinary. The neighbor next door. The co-worker in the office. The man sitting across from you on the train. This ability to blend into everyday life, to live a double life, has always been the predator's most effective camouflage. In the 1980s, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit began studying serial killers in depth, interviewing offenders like Bundy and Ed Kemper. Their work gave birth to criminal profiling, an attempt to predict behavior based on patterns. The profiles often describe the killers as white men in their 30s or 40s, socially awkward, with jobs that allow them to move freely without suspicion. And yet, despite decades of research, many killers, like the Long Island Predator, still manage to evade capture for years. By the time the Gilgo murders came to light in 2010, America already knew the horror of long-running cases. The Green River Killer had operated for nearly 20 years before he was caught. BTK, Dennis Rader, taunted police with letters for decades before DNA finally tied him to his crimes. The lesson was clear: serial killers can live undetected among us for years, even decades, while carrying out their crimes. In many ways, the Long Island serial killer fits into this lineage. His victims were women in vulnerable positions, just as Bundy and Ridgway had targeted before him. His ability to vanish into ordinary suburban life echoed John Wayne Gacy's. His use of technology, burner phones, digital anonymity, reflected the evolution of a predator in the modern age. But there is also something uniquely American about these stories. A nation of vast highways, isolated suburbs, and sprawling rural lands creates the perfect conditions for predators to hide. A culture that stigmatizes sex work leaves certain victims unprotected. And a history of law enforcement corruption, from the Green River investigation to Suffolk County, often delays justice. To understand the Gilgo case is to understand this larger pattern. The Long Island serial killer is not an outlier, he is part of a dark continuum of violence stretching across decades of American history. And as history shows us, predators thrive not just because of their cunning, but because of the blind spots of society around them. To understand the mystery of the Long Island serial killer, you must first understand the land itself. Long Island, a stretch of sand and suburbia east of New York City. Home to over 7 million people, but also to miles of lonely marshland, barrier beaches, and winding parkways. It is a place where bustling neighborhoods meet vast emptiness. And it is within those gaps, in those forgotten spaces, that predators find opportunity. The Gilgo murders were not random in their geography. Ocean Parkway, where most of the remains were found, runs parallel to the Atlantic, a thin ribbon of road separating civilization from the sea. On one side, gated communities, summer homes, and fishing clubs. On the other, miles of windswept dunes, thick reeds, and tidal marshes, where the sound of the waves drowns out everything else. It is the perfect place to hide secrets, and for years, that's exactly what it was. Law enforcement has long known that geography plays a crucial role in criminal behavior. Some killers hunt close to home. Others travel miles to distance themselves from their crimes. In the case of Long Island, the beaches themselves became both hunting ground and graveyard. The killer, investigators believe, chose Gilgo Beach because of its isolation, but also because he knew the land well enough to navigate it without drawing attention. He wasn't dumping bodies at random. He was placing them in a pattern. But Long Island's dark history stretches back further than Gilgo Beach. In the 1980s, the body of a woman known as Peaches, later identified as Valerie Mack, was discovered in a Hempstead park. Her dismembered remains were later linked to other findings along Ocean Parkway. Other unsolved murders across Suffolk County also paint a grim picture. Bodies turning up in marshes, near highways, in wooded lots. For decades, the geography of Long Island has quietly concealed horrors. And then there is the isolation. Suffolk County stretches east into the Atlantic, cut off from the rest of New York. Its highways are long, its beaches empty in the off-season. For law enforcement, this isolation makes cases harder to solve. For killers, it makes crimes easier to commit. It is no coincidence that the Gilgo victims were found in such a place on a road where few people travel at night, where headlights can't see beyond the dunes, where the ocean's roar muffles everything. Geography doesn't just shape the crimes. It shapes the culture. Long Island is divided, wealthy enclaves like the Hamptons on one side, struggling communities on the other. Within that divide, predators exploit the invisible walls between privilege and poverty. Victims who lived in cheaper motels along Route 110, who took calls from strangers, who disappeared from overlooked towns, their stories rarely crossed into the headlines until the bodies began appearing in Gilgo Beach. The geography of Long Island made the Gilgo murders possible. But it also tells us something larger: crime does not exist in a vacuum. It grows out of place, of opportunity, of landscapes that invite silence. And on this narrow stretch of road by the sea, silence reigned for far too long. The victims' lives. Beyond the headlines and the labels, who were the women and men whose stories ended along Ocean Parkway? When the news broke of bodies being discovered along Gilgo Beach, the headlines were quick to use a single word: prostitutes. But these women and one man were far more than the label the media gave them. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They laughed. They cried. They dreamed. And they mattered. This episode is their story. Shannon Gilbert, 24 years old. Spirited, ambitious, determined to build a better life for herself. She was working as an escort the night she vanished, but she had dreams of becoming a singer. Her final moments, a desperate 911 call, her screams for help, became the catalyst that exposed the burial ground of Gilgo Beach. Megan Waterman, just 22. A mother from Maine. She struggled with addiction but was known as fiercely loving toward her daughter. She traveled to Long Island in search of work, but never came home. Amber Lynn Costello, 27. A free spirit with a sharp wit. She lived with friends in West Babylon, known for her sense of humor and warmth, but was caught in the dangerous cycle of drugs and sex work. Maureen Brainard Barnes, 25. A young mother from Connecticut. She dreamed of supporting her children through modeling and escort work but fell victim to the risks of a secret life. These 4 women, together called the Gilgo Four, were found wrapped in burlap along Ocean Parkway in December 2010. Their similarities painted a chilling picture of a predator with a method. But the discoveries didn't stop there. Other remains were found scattered along the same stretch of road. Jessica Taylor, a young woman whose torso was discovered in Manorville in 2003, with other remains later linked to Gilgo Beach. Valerie Mack, once known only as Peaches, who went unidentified for nearly 2 decades. She had been dismembered, her remains scattered in multiple sites. Melissa Barthelemy, whose family received taunting phone calls after her disappearance, the killer using her phone to torment them. And then there were the unidentified. Jane Doe number 3. John Doe, sometimes referred to as Asian male, discovered near Gilgo Beach, whose identity remains a mystery. Each of them, named or unnamed, was someone who lived, who struggled, who loved. Someone whose absence left behind aching families, unanswered questions, and unfinished stories. What unites them is not just the way their lives ended, but the way society often failed them while they were alive. Many battled addiction. Many faced economic hardship. Many turned to sex work in desperation, pushed into shadows where predators wait. And yet, in those shadows, they were ignored by institutions that should have protected them. Their disappearances did not receive the same urgency as others. Their families' pleas were often met with silence. Only when their bodies were discovered together did the world finally listen. In telling the story of the Long Island serial killer, it is easy to focus on the mystery of the predator. But the true story belongs to the victims. Without them, there is no case. Without their lives, there is no tragedy. Without their memories, there can be no justice. Serial killers are not born in shadows. They are shaped by life, by circumstance, by impulse. But what truly drives a person to kill, not once, but again and again? To understand the Long Island serial killer, we must step into the darker chambers of the human mind. Psychologists have long debated the roots of serial murder. Some argue nature, biological differences in the brain, abnormalities in regions tied to empathy and impulse control. Others argue nurture, abusive childhoods, trauma, neglect, and violent conditioning. The truth, most experts agree, lies somewhere in between. Many serial killers display early warning signs: cruelty to animals, fascination with fire, a lack of remorse for hurting others. Some grow up in violent households. Others are socially isolated, unable to connect with peers. Over time, fantasies take root. At first, they are harmless daydreams. But for a certain few, those fantasies darken, becoming obsessions with domination, violence, and control. And eventually, fantasy demands reality. In the case of the Long Island Killer, those patterns appear familiar. The choice of victims, sex workers, points to a predator who craved control over people he believed society would not protect. The use of burlap to wrap the bodies suggests ritual, not a spur-of-the-moment act, but something methodical, repeated. His double life, hiding in plain sight, echoes the psychological profiles of killers like Dennis Rader, the BTK Strangler, who lived for decades as a respected family man while secretly plotting murders. Dr. Robert Hare, creator of the Psychopathy Checklist, describes killers like these as high-functioning predators. They lack empathy. They are manipulative. They are skilled at presenting masks of normalcy. On the outside, they may appear ordinary, even charming. But inside, they see other people not as human beings, but as objects to be used, dominated, and discarded. Control is often the key. For many serial killers, murder is not about rage or revenge. It is about power. The act of taking life becomes the ultimate expression of dominance, a way of silencing feelings of weakness in themselves. The Long Island Killer's methods suggest the same hunger for control. By targeting sex workers, he exploited those already living on society's margins. He calculated where to dump bodies, ensuring years would pass before discovery. To him, each victim was not a person, but a piece in a grotesque game he believed he could keep winning. Yet psychology also reveals something else, the need for risk. Over time, many killers escalate. What once satisfied them no longer does. They seek new thrills, take greater chances, taunt police, or alter their methods. This escalation has been seen in cases from Bundy to the Zodiac. And it may explain why the Long Island case remained dormant for years, then suddenly revealed clusters of bodies. It was not just murder, it was compulsion. Still, no profile is perfect. Psychology cannot map the soul completely. Each killer is different. Each case has its own path. But one thing remains constant: serial killers leave devastation in their wake, not only in their victims' families but in communities haunted by fear. And as we peel back the layers of the Long Island case, one question remains: was this compulsion born of childhood scars, or of something darker still, something we may never fully understand? To catch a killer, you need time, resources, and trust. But what happens when the very institutions meant to protect the public are fractured by corruption, politics, and neglect? The story of the Long Island serial killer is not just about one man's crimes. It is also about the failures of law enforcement that allowed those crimes to continue for so long. When the first remains were discovered in December 2010, investigators knew immediately they had uncovered more than a single crime. The Gilgo Four were found within days, wrapped in burlap, placed deliberately. Yet despite the gravity of the case, progress soon slowed. Why? Part of the problem lay within Suffolk County Police Department itself. At the time, The department was under the leadership of Chief James Burke. Later, Burke himself would be convicted of corruption and obstruction of justice, serving time in federal prison. Burke had reportedly clashed with the FBI, refusing to allow them access to the investigation. His reasoning? Pride, control, and fear of exposure of his own misconduct. This decision, shutting out federal resources, may have delayed the case by years. Burke's corruption was only the beginning. During his tenure, he was accused of fostering a culture of secrecy and retaliation. Detectives who pushed too hard risked career consequences. Leads went cold. Evidence was mishandled. And all the while, families of the victims begged for answers that never came. Beyond corruption, there were structural challenges. The victims were sex workers, many battling addiction. Their disappearances were not prioritized the way others might have been. Too often, police dismissed them as runaways or choices rather than potential victims of violent crime. This bias, viewing the women's lives through stigma, made it easier for the killer to keep hunting without fear. And then there was the geography. Multiple jurisdictions overlapped in the Gilgo case. Suffolk County, Nassau County, State Police, the FBI. Instead of working seamlessly, the agencies often clashed over resources, leadership, and strategy. In complex cases like this, where bodies are spread across counties, such friction can stall progress indefinitely. Technology was another obstacle. In 2010, cell phone tracking and DNA technology were less advanced than they are today. The killer's use of burner phones allowed him to contact victims anonymously, leaving few trails. By the time investigators traced certain signals, too much time had passed. Evidence had decayed. Calls were routed through dense networks of towers, making pinpointing locations nearly impossible. For years, the case sat in limbo, not for lack of clues, but for lack of cooperation, leadership, and urgency. Families felt abandoned. The public grew restless. And all the while, the killer remained free. In 2022, with new leadership and FBI involvement finally secured, progress was reignited. A dedicated task force began piecing together old leads with new technology. Cell tower mapping, digital forensics, and DNA analysis painted a clearer picture than ever before. The result, the arrest of Rex Heuermann in 2023. But even with a suspect in custody, questions remain. How many opportunities were missed? How many victims could have been saved if law enforcement had acted sooner? Crime does not unfold in silence. It is told, retold, and magnified by the media. In the case of the Long Island serial killer, television anchors, tabloids, podcasts, and internet forums all played a role not just in informing the public, but in shaping the investigation itself. When the Gilgo Four were discovered in December 2010, the media storm was immediate. Local papers splashed headlines of bodies on the beach. National outlets speculated about a new East Coast Ripper. The sensational framing captured attention, but it also shaped perception. The victims were too often reduced to a single word: prostitutes. Their humanity was erased by headlines chasing shock value. For the families, media coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought attention to their loved ones' disappearances, forcing law enforcement to take the case more seriously. On the other hand, the stigma of sex work meant that coverage often carried judgment, leaving families fighting not just for justice, but for dignity. And then there were the phone calls. Melissa Barthelomy's family received taunting calls after her disappearance. Investigators believe the killer himself may have made them, using her cell phone to mock her relatives. It was as if the predator was aware of the media frenzy and feeding off it, taking pleasure in the fear and headlines his crimes generated. Documentaries and podcasts soon followed. From 48 Hours to Netflix specials, the case became a fixture in true crime culture. Online sleuths pored over details, mapping theories, debating suspects. Some theories helped keep pressure on law enforcement. Others, however, spread misinformation, confusing facts with speculation, muddying the waters for both investigators and the public. The rise of social media only amplified the story. Hashtags circulated. Facebook groups dedicated to the case grew into thousands of members. Amateur detectives compared timelines, examined Google Earth images of Gilgo Beach, and dissected every available police document. The case transformed from a local tragedy into a national obsession. But media attention comes with consequences. Investigators are forced to balance transparency with secrecy, protecting evidence while facing relentless demands for updates. In Suffolk County, this pressure was heightened by years of law enforcement scandal. Each headline of corruption fueled public distrust. Each delay in the investigation created new speculation. For some, the lack of progress became its own story, one that damaged the reputation of the department for years. And yet, without the media, the Gilgo case might never have reached the level of scrutiny it did. Public pressure forced leadership changes. It forced the FBI's eventual involvement. And perhaps most importantly, it ensured that the victims' names were not forgotten. The relationship between killers and the media is complex. Some predators crave recognition. Others hide from it. But in nearly every case, publicity plays a role in shaping the story, sometimes even in shaping the killer's behavior. The Long Island serial killer case is no different. It is not just a story of crime and justice. It is also a story of how society consumes violence and how that consumption can, in turn, influence the path to justice. For more than a decade, the Long Island serial killer was a phantom. His crimes were known, his victims were mourned, but his identity remained hidden. What finally cracked the case wasn't luck. It was science. In the early years of the investigation, forensic tools were limited. Burner phones used by the killer were nearly untraceable. DNA recovery from degraded remains was difficult. and law enforcement lacked the specialized digital tools we now take for granted. But technology evolves, and killers can't keep up forever. Cell phone data became one of the first major breakthroughs. Investigators revisited records from the victims' phones, as well as the taunting calls made to Melissa Barthelomy's family. By analyzing the movement of those calls, they were able to identify a consistent pattern, many of them pinged from Midtown Manhattan, near the offices of an architect named Rex Heuermann. The same phone activity was also traced to Massapequa Park, Heuermann's suburban home. The ghost had left digital footprints. But cell data wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed something physical. That's where forensic genealogy came in, the same tool that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. Investigators recovered a pizza box that Heuermann had discarded in Manhattan. On the crust, they found DNA. That DNA matched hairs found on the burlap used to wrap some of the Gilgo victims. Suddenly, the invisible threads of the case snapped together. Technology also revealed the killer's habits. Search histories from Heuermann's devices painted a chilling picture: obsessive searches about the Gilgo case, disturbing pornography, and repeated patterns of contacting sex workers online. This digital trail showed not only behavior but intent, the premeditation of a predator who believed anonymity was permanent. And yet, what makes the forensic work remarkable is not just the tools themselves, but the patience. For over a decade, evidence sat waiting. Samples too small to analyze in 2010 became usable in 2020. Cell data too vague in 2011 became trackable in 2021 with advanced mapping. The case was never solved by one miracle, but by years of persistence combined with the relentless march of technology. Science has become law enforcement's greatest ally in hunting serial killers. But it also raises new questions. How much privacy are we willing to surrender in the name of safety? How many hidden killers will be unmasked in the coming years, as DNA and digital footprints expose crimes once thought unsolvable? For the families of the Gilgo victims, the answer is simple. Without these tools, justice might never have come. For Rex Heuermann, technology was the mask he thought would protect him. In the end, it became the very net that brought him down. The arrest of Rex Heuermann was only the beginning. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach murders haunted Long Island. Now, in the courtroom, the ghost finally has a face. But in America, every accused criminal, even the most reviled, is entitled to a defense. And in this trial, the stakes could not be higher. Prosecutors entered the case armed with a mountain of evidence. DNA found on a pizza crust. Hairs recovered from burlap that matched Heuermann's family line. Cell phone data placing him near the victims. Search histories filled with violent fantasies. To the state, the story was clear: Rex Heuermann was the Long Island serial killer. But trials are not built on suspicion, they are built on proof. The defense immediately struck back, arguing that DNA can be contaminated, that cell phone pings can be imprecise, that online searches alone do not make a murderer. They painted Hoyerman as a scapegoat, an eccentric architect, yes, but not a killer. In courtrooms across America, juries are asked to weigh science against doubt. And this trial was no different. Forensic genealogy, once celebrated in the Golden State Killer case, was now under attack. Could distant familial DNA really prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Or could it ensnare the wrong man? Every expert witness became a battlefield. Every cross-examination, a war of words. The families of the victims filled the gallery. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and children sat silently as the evidence was laid out. For them, every detail was a wound reopened, every photograph a reminder of what was lost. The courtroom was not just a place of law, it was a place of grief. Media swarmed outside, turning the courthouse into a stage. Commentators dissected testimony daily. Documentaries were filmed in real time. For the public, the trial was spectacle. For the families, it was a fight for closure. For Hoyerman, it was a battle for his life. The question looming over the jury was not just whether Rex Hoyerman killed the Gilgo victims. It was also whether law enforcement's failures, years of missed leads, corruption, and delay would create just enough doubt to let him walk free. Because in the American legal system, the burden is heavy, beyond a reasonable doubt. And sometimes, even mountains of evidence can crumble under its weight. The world waits. Will justice finally be delivered for the Gilgo victims? Or will this case remain, even after trial, another unsolved scar in the history of American true crime? Behind every victim of the Long Island serial killer is a family forever changed. The headlines told of bodies on the beach. The police reports spoke of burlap and bones. But for the families, these were not just cases, they were daughters, sisters, mothers, loved ones who never came home. Maureen Brainerd Barnes' sister, Melissa Cann, never stopped searching. She traveled to Long Island again and again, pressing police, speaking to reporters, keeping her sister's name alive. When the bodies were finally discovered, she said it was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief that Maureen had been found. Heartbreak that the ending was final. Amber Costello's family remembered her as a girl full of laughter, a woman who fought hard against addiction but often lost the battle. Her relatives said the stigma of her lifestyle made them feel judged, as though Amber somehow deserved her fate. They knew better. To them, she was not a statistic. She was love, flesh, and memory. Megan Waterman's mother fought with ferocity for her daughter's case to be taken seriously. She reminded the world that Megan was more than her struggles. She was a mother herself, a young woman whose little girl was left behind. Shannon Gilbert's family became the loudest voice in the entire case. Shannon's disappearance, and her chilling 911 call, had led police to Gilgo Beach in the first place. But when her remains were found in 2011, police insisted she may have drowned by accident, not been murdered. Her mother, Maury Gilbert, refused to accept that. She fought relentlessly to prove her daughter was also a victim of the killer. Mari's persistence kept the case alive in the media for years. Tragically, Mari's own life ended violently in 2016, when she was killed by another daughter suffering from mental illness. Yet even in death, Mari's determination became part of Shannon's legacy, a reminder that families often carry the investigation when institutions fail. Other families endured in silence. Some lacked resources to travel, to hire lawyers, to speak to cameras. But their grief was no less. Their losses, no smaller. Every Christmas table with an empty chair. Every birthday that passed without a call. Every news headline that forced them to relive the nightmare. The families also became advocates. They pushed for better protections for sex workers, for police reform, for changes in how missing persons cases are prioritized. To them, justice meant more than convicting a killer. It meant making sure no other family endured the same neglect, the same silence. True crime often risks reducing victims to footnotes in the story of the predator. But the families never allowed that here. They reclaimed the narrative. Through tears, through anger, through exhaustion, they reminded the world these women were human. They mattered. And they will not be forgotten. For the families, the fight continues. The arrest of Rex Heuermann brought some measure of hope, but it did not erase years of pain. It did not answer every question. It did not bring their loved ones back. Justice, for them, is still unfinished. The Gilgo Beach murders were never just about one man, or even about the victims alone. They reshaped an entire community. They cast a long shadow across Long Island, a place of suburban comfort, ocean breezes, and tight-knit towns suddenly haunted by the specter of a serial killer. Before the murders, Gilgo Beach was little more than a quiet stretch of sand, a place for fishing, surfing, and summer barbecues. Families visited, lovers walked the shoreline, and locals thought of it as safe. But after December 2010, when police stumbled upon 4 bodies buried in burlap, the beach became infamous. The waves still crashed. The gulls still circled. But the sand carried a different memory, one of death and dread. Fear rippled across the south shore of Long Island. Women who worked as escorts felt more vulnerable than ever. Families locked doors they had once left open. Neighbors eyed each other differently, wondering if the killer lived just down the block. In truth, he did. Rex Heuermann was not some drifter or shadowy stranger. He was an architect, a father, a man who took the train into Manhattan every day. The realization shattered a community's sense of security. If the monster could live among them, who else might be hiding behind a mask of normalcy? The murders also exposed deep divisions. Many questioned why the disappearances of sex workers had been ignored for so long. Why police resources had not been poured into finding them earlier. Activists accused authorities of apathy, suggesting that if the victims had been wealthy, white-collar women from privileged families, the case might have been solved years earlier. The community wrestled not only with fear of the killer, but with anger at the institutions meant to protect them. Local businesses near Gilgo Beach changed too. For some, the notoriety drew attention, curious visitors, journalists, filmmakers. But for others, the association with murder meant decline, their towns branded as crime scenes rather than escapes. Even now, years after the discovery, Long Island is not the same. Parents tell their children the story as a warning. Teenagers dare each other to visit the beach at night. True crime tourists arrive with cameras, looking for traces of the mystery. And residents, though grateful for an arrest, still live with unease. Because for every body identified, for every question answered, others remain unresolved. Could there be more victims buried out there? Could there be more killers? The legacy of Gilgo is more than fear, it is also vigilance. The case sparked broader conversations about safety, policing, and justice. It inspired reforms in how missing persons are reported, how marginalized communities are protected, and how technology is used in investigations. But the scars remain. Long Island, once defined by beaches and boardwalks, now carries a darker name in the history of American crime. Every community that discovers a serial killer has to reconcile two truths. That evil can grow in the most ordinary places. And that ordinary people, families, neighbors, investigators, advocates, must find ways to carry on. For every answer the Gilgo Beach case has provided, there remain just as many questions. The arrest of Rex Heuermann brought headlines of resolution. But beneath those headlines lies a maze of loose ends, mysteries that may never be fully solved. The first and most haunting question: are there more victims? The remains discovered along Ocean Parkway between 2010 and 2011 tell only part of the story. In total, at least 10 sets of human remains were found in the area. Some were linked to the so-called Gilgo 4, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. But others remain unidentified. Skeletal fragments belonging to unknown women, a toddler, and even a man were found. Were these all victims of Rex Heuermann? Or were there multiple killers using the same stretch of land to dispose of bodies? Investigators have long debated whether Gilgo Beach was a dumping ground for more than one predator. Some of the bodies were wrapped in burlap, others dismembered. Some matched Heuermann's supposed type, petite sex workers, but others did not. The differences in method and victim profile suggest the possibility of more than one killer. If true, it would mean that even as one monster sits in custody, another may still be free. Then there is the mystery of Shannan Gilbert. Her disappearance led police to the beach in the first place. Yet her death remains contested. Officially, authorities suggested she drowned in the marsh after becoming disoriented. But her 23-minute 911 call, her frantic knocking on doors that night, and her body's location near the others make many, including her family, believe she was murdered. If Shannan was not a victim of Heuermann, then who chased her into the darkness? And why? Another unsolved thread lies in the unidentified remains. In this first part, we have retraced the haunting discovery along Gilgo Beach, the victims, the crime scenes, and the first steps of an investigation clouded by uncertainty. But this case is much bigger than what we've seen so far. The unanswered questions, the missed opportunities, and the hidden truths are only just beginning to surface. In Part 2, we continue this journey uncovering the prime suspects, the failures within law enforcement, and the shocking turns that pushed the case back into the spotlight.